make this time are able to access it, but also you will be sent the link to the recording after this webinar, so you can pause it, play it back, share it with colleagues, all the things that you would want to do to support your CPD. If you're not used to this system, we're using Adobe Connect, and there's a number of things just to draw your attention to. So in the bottom right hand corner you can see that there is a chat area. Please use that chat area for any comments or questions. If you have a question, we will try to identify it as we go through. It really helps if you start with a capital Q, just to let us know it's a question, but don't worry if you forget that. We will try and pick up any comments or questions as we go through. Above there is a quick poll. You can see just to get a feel for how familiar people are with the subject of instructional design, and I can see that just over 40% are fairly familiar, about 20% never heard of it, and 36% are asking the question, what's instructional design? We haven't asked our expert to fill this in, but I'm glad that nobody else says that they've started writing books on the subject so far, so brilliant. Also on this screen, whilst we're here, at the top of the screen, you should see you've got an icon of a person holding their hand up, and using that icon you can set the status. So in the attendance list and participants, if I can say it, names, if I click on laughter as an example, you'll see at the end of learning futures in the attendees list, then that little icon shows up. If you do wish to use that, just remember to clear the status. So go back onto the drop down arrow and clear the status afterwards to take away that status setting. Okay, so please feel free to use it as we go along. There's also the option, if you haven't found it already, there's a drop down arrow at the end of your your speaker, and you can adjust the speaker volume if you can't make anything loud enough through your computer speakers. Should you find that everything goes quiet, you may well have found that your internet connection has kicked you off. If that happens, just come straight back into the meeting. We will continue, and as I say, the recording is happening, so you'll have a copy of that as well. If you find that one of the speakers gets kicked off, then it will take them about a minute to come back into the room as well, so hang fire, and one of us will be here to make sure that you're not there on your own waiting for something to happen. So we should be okay, but it's always tempting fate to suggest that it's all going to run smoothly. Our presenters today then, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Daniel Whiston. Daniel, if you'd like to say hi.
Hello.
Brilliant, thanks Daniel. So Daniel runs Prescient and has a wealth of experience within instructional design. He's put together a really good content for us today, and I'm going to introduce him in a second. But before we move on to Daniel's input, those that are not familiar with this process, the idea behind these webinars is part of our CPD framework. So we want to share with you the expertise from people that work in the industry and that are known, recognised leaders within the area that they're working within the industry. And we wish to engage you through those webinars. We've then put together some resources and activities to help you apply some of this back into your place of work. So if you find that there's some content within the webinar and you think that's great, that's really got my interest going, I want to do some more about this, then we've put some resources and activities that I'm going to take you through at the end of the webinar just to show how we can support you doing that. The deal is, if you find something interesting, please share it, come back onto the Learning Future site, use a blog, use one of the useful resources areas, but share how it's worked for you. So if you've shared something that we've provided, the webinar, any of the resources or activities, let us know how you've used it, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what you've adapted, and perhaps what it's led on to as well. So we've got a growing community of practice on that site, over 500 practitioners through all different range of job roles. So please feel free to use that and share and build to that community. You'll probably be aware by now that this is one of a number of webinars. So we've got most of them are recorded by now, so you can access those recordings. I can see Tom made a comment that we've had a process where we've asked you to register for the webinars to get the recording if you couldn't attend the live webinar. We're starting to move towards putting those recording links onto the website and just ask people to make us aware of who's using it as we go through. So you will see those changes that are happening to the site shortly, but if you do have a problem, then by all means either drop me an email and I can get that sorted through our admin department, or you may find that it's by the time you've had this webinar you might have got an email back anyhow to let you know where those recordings are. So a whole range of CPD activities If you found this one useful and you haven't looked at the others, then I'd strongly recommend have a quick look at the others. So today's agenda, we're going to ask Daniel in a minute to give his presentation. We'll take questions and answers. As I say, please use the chat area, and if you can start with the letter Q, that would be really helpful so we know it's a question that you want an answer to. And then I will take you through the supporting resources and CPD activity at the end. So I'm going to close down these slides and just bring up Daniel's slides. They should be on your screen shortly. Okay, that's just loading. Wonderful. So as I say, I'm delighted to introduce Daniel, and I'm going to hand over to Daniel now for his input on instructional design.
Thanks, Rob. Hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining the session today. I really hope you're going to enjoy the next half an hour a lot. It is a fascinating subject, and I think also a really empowering field to be working in if you're confident that you know what you're doing, and hopefully I can help you get some measure towards that. Now, I appreciate that all of you are involved in instructional design to differing extents. Obviously, some of you have said you're familiar with it, some of you aren't. So what I'm going to say doesn't assume any prior knowledge, but it hopefully will also add to the working practice of people that are already in the area at the same time. I'd like to just add to what Rob said by way of introduction, but I'm very keen for this to be a two-way thing. So please do raise questions at any point in the field, the IMS field, and I will do my best to answer them. I've built specific questions and pauses for reflection into the presentation, but please jump in at any point. So, my name is Daniel Whiston. In the bottom right corner of each slide, please forgive the constant LinkedIn icon. I don't have shares in it, but as I don't have a website as an instructional designer, in terms of ID, that's my online presence. If you'd like to know more about what I do as a practitioner, you can find extensive details there, and it would be great to connect with all of you. In the bottom left, as Rob mentioned, is the icon for Prescient. That's a company that I'm involved with that produces animated infographics, which are a specialist kind of output within the field of ID. Broadly speaking, they're a kind of animated trailer that communicates something graphically that's quite dense, but needs some clarity in terms of the messaging. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. Oh, Bev Owens can't hear me. Can everybody else hear me? Can anybody else not hear me at the moment? I'm going to assume everyone else can hear me. Okay, brilliant. Well, let me get on to the first slide proper. I've been an ID for almost 20 years now. I started off at a .com called Wide Learning. Sorry, I'm just reading the messages. It sounds like most people can hear me, but let me know if not. Started off at a .com called Wide Learning. It doesn't exist anymore, but for a time it was the largest finance and compliance supplier in the UK e-learning industry. And since then I've been a freelance consultant for almost 15 years, which means I've got a wealth of experience in a bunch of different projects. I'm trying to get the pointer working now, but it's not. Here we go. Sorry guys. The green arrow should be appearing on the screen in a moment. Here we go. Okay, so I thought what I'd do is start off by talking through a few of the things that I've done in the past, just to give you an idea of the kind of range of things that an instructional designer works on. Before I do that, I actually will take a slight step back and just give a kind of brief sketch of the kind of variety of content that you can get involved with, because I know that most or all of you work in the FE sector. And obviously there's a range of content within that kind of field, and in fact I do a lot of work for the FE sector, for example in terms of diversity and inclusion in FE colleges, or child safety, safekeeping, that kind of thing. Now what I'm going to do within this slide, I think, is look at some of the specific examples. So up here, top left corner, this is a game. It was designed for children in the primary system, teaching them about history of the Indus Valley. As you can see, hopefully, there's a little guy in the spotlight who is the player's character, who walks around, has various conversations with historical figures, and learns about Indian history whilst completing a storyline. That was a very involved and complex project with a quite high budget, but it was a lot of fun to work on, and the ID principles we're going to cover apply to writing a game just as much as they do to a course. And in some ways that was a particularly interesting experience as an ID, because within any ID project, ID role, the vital thing is to get the source material you need from the subject matter expert, the academic, whoever's commissioned the course. And often it involves meetings, lots of documents, extensive briefings, but in this case, the content for the entire project was a Ladybird book on Indian history. But it was more than adequate for the project, and it contained some wonderful gems, such as the fact that goat poo was central to the entire economy of the time, and obviously the user group, consisting of young children, loved that, went down very well. Over here, on the right-hand side of the screen, is an example of something which isn't interactive, it's not rich media, it's a poster. I don't know if you can see it at this resolution, hopefully you can get some details. I wrote this for BP's global induction site, so everyone who joins BP around the world has to look at this. And what it is, it's an induction outline in terms of an infographic poster. And I'd only show an extract, but I think you can get the sense that it shows you what you're supposed to be doing in your first week, what you should be doing after your first month. It's very graphically rich and text light, and that's also something important in ID. Try and strip down the words on screen as much as possible. Embed links to further resources that people might be able to use. Thank you, Maria. Sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I'm sure I got it wrong. I'm terrible at pronouncing people's names. But you're absolutely right. It was very much a useful insight by the client. The client came up with that idea, which I really appreciated. The overall induction website for BP invested a large amount of money in having some beautiful motion graphics about the world of BP with an oil refinery and all sorts of things about how they do business. But what they wanted was something very practical that people could download, perhaps pin by their desks, or indeed have from their phones or tablets, and reuse as they needed it. And I've reused the approach quite a lot since. And so an infographics poster approach, I think, is quite a striking way to communicate information online, and doesn't necessarily have to have a really high bandwidth media component as well, so it's very broadly accessible across a range of different platforms. Down here is an example of a televisual product that I worked on for the BBC. It was their production safety course, and this particular clip shows a young child sliding on a rope over a raging river. And so clearly, with that kind of subject matter, it's absolutely vital to get it right, but given the audience group and the culture of the organisation, it was very necessary to be engaging and media rich. Picachart.com, brilliant. Yeah, good point. This one was bespoke, specifically drawn for the organisation, but it's good to know that there are other assets out there. Right, let's look at a few more examples. Okay, so here we have, like I say, another 2 examples of interesting kind of things that you can work on. So here is an animated infographic. I don't know if you can read it at this magnification, but it comes in sequence and things build up and disappear. It's quite short, but it has some statistics. It's a key message about the interest of young people who are job seekers and the problems companies have not being able to fill some of the jobs that they would like to recruit for. So to try and put something across in an engaging way, people might virally spread, look on their phones, and it can act as a kind of trailblazer to a broader learning resource. And finally, by way of examples, down here is an example of a conventional, in terms of its design, e-learning course. I imagine to those of you who have engaged with ID and e-learning so far, you may well have produced a module or a course. Now, this was done for Tetra Pak, who make cartons for milk and such things globally. And the interesting thing for me about this example was the way that localization was taken advantage of. Now, that's something that often does apply within ID for global organizations, which means that you have to translate the content into different languages. And then there are all sorts of little specialist tips and tricks for that kind of endeavor, such as not having too much text, because some languages have more character counts than English. So, for example, German would need more words in that box. But I particularly like the way that the calligraphy here was built into the interface, and the way that the designer had the time and the skill to work in Chinese calligraphy and icons to the product design to make it really authentic, to connect with that user group so that they would presumably engage with the learning and take it more seriously. Another quick point to make about this before I get on is that in terms of, this being the one I wasn't pointing to, but now I am, in terms of the infographic, it was a good example for me as an ID of being critically engaged with the client. Often, one of the most important things that an instructional designer can do is challenge the assumptions the client thinks they have about what they need. In this case, the client was an environmental consultancy, and they thought they wanted a huge amount of words on the screen. They wanted a lot of complex messages to be communicated with great precision into detail and length. And I managed to convince them that, in fact, given that they said they wanted to interest people that were perhaps not receptive to their messages and get them to look into it in more detail later on, the important thing was to be graphically rich, keep the message really focused, and hook people's attention. So I'd say, again, one of the key things an ID can do is to look at the assumptions behind a project and make sure they hold water, and to challenge in a friendly way when appropriate. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. At the end of me talking about what I do as a practitioner is a quick overview of the kinds of organisations that I work for. Who needs IDs? To do what? So in terms of that, in the top left corner, these are some of the organisations that I work for directly. The BBC, Pearson, and the College of Estate Management are recent clients. College of Estate Management being a university that's linked with the University of Reading. Now, when you work for a large organisation directly, there seems, in my experience, to be a kind of two-way split between the kind of thing that they want. People like Pearson have used me as a kind of high-level process designer. They might be in the education sector already, like yourselves, but they may not have the depth of experience of producing e-learning or interactive educational content. And they may want an instructional designer to help their experts and writers organise themselves and get the most out of the project. Conversely, College of Estate Management were producing a MOOC, a massive open online course, so a degree or master's course that can be taken by thousands of people simultaneously, perhaps around the world. And they had a lot of process design already, so what they wanted were people like myself to join a wider team and actually write, design and produce learning materials on a huge scale to meet the needs of these degree and master's level students. Over here on the right of the screen, we have traditional e-learning agencies. Now, I'm imagining that some of you might have had an awareness or dealings with people like Lemess, Kineo, Marshall ACM, Attic, or Sponge. So, has anybody here had any kind of interaction with an e-learning agency? I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, so Kineo up here delivered a session on badging. Okay, so you've heard some of you at least have heard of some of the names. Well, these are the kind of people who, okay. Well, in future, if you did encounter agencies like this, right, so lots of people have heard of Kineo. Well, I've worked for Kineo before, not hugely, but I have. Just as a kind of side comment, those of you who do have an awareness of people like these organisations might have noticed that a lot of them seem to cluster in Brighton on the south coast. That's just an historical accident that Brighton is perhaps, geographically speaking, in terms of its size, the UK capital of e-learning, aside from London. And that's because there's a huge organisation that's now called Leo, that used to be called Epic, that was just for some historical reason located in Brighton about 40 years ago. And loads of people like Kineo, Lemess, other people like Brightwave, all span out of that larger organisation. So that means that if you do ever have a need for specialist e-learning support from a large agency or a specialist design setup, Brighton is probably a good place to look. And then over here, in the third quarter, the third, you have non-e-learning agencies who are involved in that kind of sector. So here, a bit of a faint logo, but there's a company called Complete Control. They produce the game The Indus Valley Trader that I work for. And here at Tilt, who are a very high-end digital production house that specialise in animations and motion graphics. And increasingly, I think, you've got people like these You're getting involved in making e-learning, or what you might effectively call e-learning, but it might look much more creative. It might feel much more like a game. It might even be based around a famous brand. So these guys produce a lot of educational materials for children based around, say, Steve Beebe's properties, or Charlie and Lola, if any of you, or The Night Garden. If any of you have got children, you might recognise those names. But it still requires the same kind of skill set. Okay. So, now that I've got some of the introductions out of the way, I think it'd be good to actually have a little activity to show an underlying point that I'm quite keen to make. So, what I'd like each of you to do is to have a look at these simple instructions, and at home or at work, wherever you are, have a go at doing this. So, if you're right or left-handed, take your dominant hand, curl the ring finger and middle finger into your palm, extend the index finger, thumb and little finger and splay at 45-degree angles. I'm expecting great things out of Rob, by the way. And having done that, raise your arm. Now I'm giving everyone a minute to have another read of these, think about it, and try and do your best to make the shape with your hand that I'm talking about. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Not Spock. It's supposed to be this, which many of you might imagine is the traditional heavy metal hand salute. So, Rob, I expect you're very familiar with that, given all the hard rock that I know you listen to. Now, the point here is a serious one. Oh, I'm looking at the comments there. Awkward in the middle of the staff room. Sorry. I hope that didn't look appropriate when you tried to do that. But at least some people are on their own. But that's what it should have looked like. Now, there are 2 points here, 2 serious points. So let's have a look. What are they? Okay, first of all, let's look at the first point, demonstration. It's usually much more effective to show someone how to do something and get them to do it than just tell them how to do something in a dry, non-interactive way. And I think a lot of e-learning and online education which fails for that reason. Demonstrate things. Get learners to apply them. As it says on screen, the best way to teach someone to do something is to actually try and get them to do it. I think we all find that it's probably true if we reflect on our personal learning experiences, and it's just as true if you're doing something as an instructional designer. Now, it applies in any number of contexts, I think, this principle of trying to get people to do something in terms of learning how to do it. So I'd like everyone to have a think, and if anyone could think of any examples of a particular subject area which lends itself especially to that, I'd be interested to hear anyone's thoughts if you could type in the box. Cookery, perfect example. Changing a tire, again, brilliant example. Map reading, hairdressing. Yep, practical stuff, but it doesn't have to be practical. And I am specifically thinking about stuff that's online. So I agree with all of those examples. More coming in, but in the meantime, I'll just move on to give a few e-learning kind of examples. IT, right, so that's the first one I was going to talk about. Systems training. That's a real classic thing that e-learning does, that IDs, instructional designers, would work to produce. So, for example, interactive walkthroughs of a system, rather than telling someone which file menu they should click on, which button is useful, what kind of metadata that they should label an asset in a content management system. Video activity is perfect. For example, I worked for American Express using a new document, it's about 5 years old, but it was very new then, a new document repository system called Documentum. And that involved uploading documents, later on downloading them, adding metadata to say when they've been uploaded, what they were for. And the way that you do that kind of thing effectively as an ID is to follow a kind of a 3-stage model of showing someone something. So, for example, an animated screen capture of a particular procedure that you're trying to communicate. Then letting them try, giving them a kind of interactive test, as it were, and then feeding back on them to let them know how they've done. But it also lends itself to process training. So imagine interviews. recruitment. A very interesting project I was involved in some years ago was to do the ID for the BBC's recruitment and selection training. And one of the approaches we took there, oh sorry, yes, Mr. Webber, he was talking about hooks. I'll get to those in a sec. But to give a second example of the letting people try and do something approach, in the context of a recruitment procedure, we had a fly-on-the-wall video interview approach. So what we did was used actors to film an interview as it was conducted, with different kind of decision points within it. So you played the role, the learner played the role of the interviewer and selected questions to ask, and then got a very range of responses that were positive or negative, ineffective or ineffective, and then they got to ask another question. And going through all of this was feedback which was clarifying why certain approaches weren't working or why certain other approaches were. So they actually had a go at conducting an interview and seeing how a candidate responds. And finally, the example of maths, if you're teaching something academic, again, you can just focus on teaching people principles and rules, or you can also get them to actually conduct a series of mathematical calculations and assess them and get people used to actually kind of performing different functions. And now in terms of the hooks element, okay, fine. Well, the value of a hook in terms of a surprising or interesting or funny kind of experience is that within any kind of linear learning experience, such as an e-learning course, which is often what an ID outputs, it's important to prod people early on in the learning experience to make them pay attention, which is what I hope I just did to some extent. And there's a range of ways you can do that. So, for example, you can do something unexpected. You can have a surprising fact. Did you know? Statistics. So one example that I particularly liked was I did a course for Heineken in the Netherlands, and the actual learning content was about SAP, which, if you don't know it, I don't know it particularly, is an automated online kind of system for managing financial records and costs and accountancy and that kind of thing. But we needed to make people, underlying that was the need to make people accept that they needed to make a change, they needed to adapt this new practice. So what we did was we had a question right at the start about resistance to change generally, to really kind of make them pay attention. And so what do you think, when I ask you this question in a minute, the example was scurvy in the Royal Navy in Britain. And so the question was, from the time historically when it was discovered that vitamin C in the form of lemons would stop soldiers getting scurvy and dying, how long do you think it took the British Navy to adapt giving lemons to sailors as an official policy? So, anyone got any idea? I now have to confess. Yeah, someone's going in the right direction. I must confess, I don't have. I think John E. BDC is closer. It was something like 267 years. Once it had been medically established that it would stop soldiers dying, it still took over 250 years for the Navy to actually do it. Resistance to change is an enormous factor. A large amount of what e-learning attempts to do is to get people to change their behaviour. So generally speaking, it can be useful to address that in a way which makes people aware of their own attitude towards absorbing something new. Right. Oh yes, sorry, about to move on. But yes, another way of doing it is to hook someone in, is to present a challenge, a question, a scenario, or to tell them a story, something which will not necessarily prod them to make a correct or incorrect response, but will really resonate in terms of what the course is trying to achieve. Okay, now after all that preamble, I'm now going to actually get stuck in with something which a lot of traditional e-learning people would do right at the start. Learning outcomes, learning outcomes, learning outcomes. These are your friend. As an ID, you need to fall in love with them and use them in everything that you do, and they will serve you well. So in terms of the learning outcomes for this particular session, we're going to end up in a position where all of you can hopefully give a definition of instructional design, explain the importance of instructional design, list common features of good instructional design, and then give 5 top tips for effective ID. Now, what I'm doing here is quite traditional, listing stuff, but I think that adult learners respond well to being able to frame what they're about to learn. So tell people up front before designing a course. Don't be shy. And it also has the benefit of helping measure return on investment when you've actually designed a piece of online learning. For example, you could use the learning outcomes to frame a post-course quiz or questionnaire about. Okay, so here we have a piece of reflection for you guys. What is instructional design? I've been using the phrase quite a lot. I know some of you are familiar with it, some of you haven't heard of it. So I'm now going to ask you guys to reflect on your own personal knowledge of it and put a few words in the chat area. What does it mean for you? Multiple attendees are typing. I'm expecting to be very impressed by this. Designing learning, flipped learning, designing effective online learning content, like that. Organising and collating information to facilitate learning. Yep, that's a useful insight. Guiding people how to learn based on learning theory, lesson planning and skilled work. Yes, I like Joe's observation there that when you say it's the equivalent of something, I think it's absolutely vital that people are confident to re-leverage the knowledge they've already got from designing classroom sessions, for example, and using that online, because a lot of it does apply. Yep, these are all really, really useful definitions. What I'm going to do now is move forward and look at Wikipedia's definition. Now, I'm talking about Wikipedia for an example for a reason that will become clear later on, but it's always a good place to start. Instructional design is the practice of creating instructional experiences which make the acquisition of knowledge and skill more efficient, effective, and appealing. Now, I think a lot of the definitions that you guys have come up with, I prefer to this one. I was putting it up as a bit of a straw man, although it has a lot of value. It's fair enough, but it's a bit official, it's a bit traditional, and for me it's a bit too formal and makes ID sound like some kind of dry technical skill, which I don't think it is or should be if it's going to be effective. So what do I say it is? I say instructional design is deciding what people will learn and how it will be presented to them in visible brackets online. It can be very empowering to clarify the basic essential nature of what ID is. I don't think it's something that only experts should have opinions on. A lot of it is common sense, and as I just said in terms of one of the definitions that was given in the chat area, a lot of it does involve re-leveraging things that classroom teachers already are quite familiar with in terms of lesson planning and giving a structure to things. So, it's important to be confident where confidence is deserved, and if you are an experienced teacher, you will already be a long way towards becoming an effective ID. Now, another way of looking at it is this. Sometimes I work with very experienced clients who know as much or more about it as I do, but sometimes I need to explain what I do to someone who might not have any idea and might be a little bit intimidated by e-learning or phrases like instructional design. And what I say to such people is that, broadly speaking, an ID can be thought of as being similar to a TV or movie scriptwriter. Now, I haven't heard that offered by a lot of my peers, but I think it holds true. In terms of where you fit in, you're in a production team. You get an initial briefing from a client. Could be internal, could be external. You write a storyboard. Developers, coders, graphic designers, perhaps yourself will build elements of it, and it will be published and broadcast. It might be broadcast to millions of people, but it will still be presented in a final way to a group of viewers. So the type of people that I work with, that you yourselves may work with as an ID, are subject matter experts, often called SMEs, who provide content. Designers, graphic designers, who can make wonderful images like the infographics we looked at, might help you put videos together and audio assets, and developers who actually put it all together into a package. Now, I think it's also important to briefly touch on what an ID isn't. An ID is not a content expert, generally speaking, in the subject matter of the course or app that they're producing. Now, they may be. Perhaps it's something that you happen to know something about from your personal life or in a previous job. Perhaps it relates to an area where you teach already and you're doing a course online as a kind of output from that. But generally speaking, the core of being an ID is not being expected to be an expert on everything that you produce. And that's quite a crucial point. And I've had problems, or rather projects that have been very challenging in the past when clients have misunderstood that. So what an ID is an expert on learning design, not content. Now, that makes you a bit of a proxy learner. To the extent that you're ignorant of the content, you're learning it just as the user will, and that has huge value. I've often seen a lot of ineffective learning provided or produced by subject matter experts who did an ID role themselves and perhaps started at the wrong level, under-explained things, didn't factor in that other people didn't learn it, weren't able to learn the content as quickly as they were. So there's a lot of value in drawing a line between being an expert in learning design or instructional design and an expert in the content itself. Why does ID matter? Okay, well, I've got two stories here. First of which, over here, is to do with a course that I designed for BP in terms of engine technology. Now, here the issue was that they hadn't really decided explicitly enough and clearly enough what should be taught and how. And so potentially they were going to end up missing a group of learners who were quite important. It was about engine technology and lubricants, and my personal background in terms of the content was that at that point I couldn't drive, so I knew very, very little about engines. And I asked a lot of what seemed like stupid questions, and I was starting at a reasonably advanced level. And in the process of me asking those questions, they realised that in fact a large number of their learners didn't know either. They had a large number of non-technical staff, so they decided to add a few introductory modules, one of which started with the amusingly named suck, squeeze, bang, blow model, which, if you don't know, is perhaps the simplest way you can describe how a combustion engine works. It sucks in air, it squeezes it until it's very compressed, it adds a fuel and a spark until it bangs, and then it all blows out again and turns the wheels of the car, ultimately. But they wouldn't have covered it otherwise. And if I hadn't been there as an ID, if it was just the subject matter experts deciding what was being taught, a lot of the learners would have been quite confused. So that's a proxy learning. Over here is a very different example from the BBC course. Now, this BBC course that I did was about production safety. Now, obviously, there are things to do with safety like manual handling and first aid, which we can all probably think of, but some things are much more subtle. And when we interviewed learners about the day-to-day working experience and the challenges that they faced, a terrible problem, potential problem, safety problem, emerged. So, in a nutshell, the story here is you can see this gentleman is holding a gun. Now, it was a local news story where an eccentric person had built a house without permission. The council were going to destroy it, and he turned up with a gun. And what happened next was very tragic. He essentially was surrounded, it doesn't show you here, but he was essentially ultimately surrounded by journalists, including BBC people, in a big circle, whilst he was pointing a gun. And now, tragically, he ended up shooting and killing on camera the council official who was trying to demolish his house. But seeing as the journalists were all standing in a circle around him, he ended up shooting the BBC presenter as well. And the actual learning point here was something called social referencing, which is that when we showed the clip in the course, you could see that all the journalists were looking at each other to see if they were concerned. And all of them decided as a group, well, if no one else is worried, I'm not either. And they all stayed, which is the opposite of what they should do. What they should have done was make an individual judgment that this guy was clearly deranged and they should run away quickly. So, again, if we hadn't probed the learner challenges, it would have been easy to miss that kind of point. I guess a kind of less dramatic impact of not having instructional design that's rigorous is that you can end up making something which is essentially very dull and unengaging. So that's a second point. You may, if you've done the learning course, have encountered a classic example of a screen saying something like, now let's work through this 17-stage process. Or a question, a so-called question in scare quotes that says, in a fire, it's vital to get to safety quickly. Is this true or false? Which is purely going to irritate a learner who's not being respected because someone hasn't really empathised with the fact that someone's going to learn from this course who has a demanding set of requirements and needs something that's going to be quite high level. So, if you use builders without an architect, or to return to my film metaphor, a film without script, you might get unexpected results, but you'll probably get a big mess that won't do what you want it to. So in a nutshell, no ID means you're going to have accidental learning design, which is probably going to be bad learning design. Okay, another reflective point. What makes good ID? If you wouldn't mind reflecting on your personal knowledge of instructional design, and then writing a few words about what you think makes for a good instructional design experience. Suited to the audience. Yep, very true. Yep, not an excessive amount of text, absolutely right. Clear outcomes, yep, that's right. Interesting, challenging, not boring, yeah, all very, very true. So here are my top 5 effective instructional, short but sweet, agreed, relevant graphics, yep. Okay, well, many of my points have been covered already, which is great, but I'm going to zip through them anyway, which is my 5 features of solid ID work. The first 2 are kind of complementary. Well, they are in fact complementary, but I've split them out. I think at a high level for a project, an ID needs to think about the organisational need. Why does the organisation need to do the training? Simple questions to ask. What needs to be done differently in the real world? What do people need to do that they're not doing? What do they need to stop doing that they're doing right now? It could be academic. It might be a compliance need. There might be a legal requirement to train people in doing something. But if you don't know this, the chances are the project will fail. And surprisingly often, the answer you get from asking this question clearly might not be as you first thought, or it might need to be amended. Secondly, map the learner profiles, which is a fancy way of saying who's going to learn this stuff. A famous, well-known process for this is called action mapping by a lady called Kathy Moore, who I'll link to at the end of the presentation. But more broadly, so what Kathy Moore says is it's about identifying barriers to learners doing something. So she's often business focused and focused solely on transferring the knowledge to them that enables them to overcome these barriers and do a particular task more effectively. But that doesn't always work in an academic context. So what's the profile of your learners? What's their style, preferred style of learning? Do they like to read? Do they like watching videos? Is there a formal training culture? Do they like to dip in and out of bite-sized objects? Do they prefer face-to-face learning traditionally? And you've got to address that and learn approaches from that. Are they self-driven, using phones to look stuff up as they need it? Or something else? It's really important to try and, at least in some way, measure and profile the learners who are going to be going through it. And finally, what's their existing knowledge level? Are they experts with a need for a top-up? Are they absolute beginners? Are they both? Often it's a range of knowledge levels, and as an ID, you need to accommodate that in terms of how you design the course. So chopping out the organisational need and the learner profile will basically give you, in my experience, the essence of what a particular module, course, app, game, anything else should be. You get those 2 defined to at least some extent, you're going to be on very solid ground. Then as you progress, learning outcomes, learning outcomes, learning outcomes. What is a learning outcome? Well, I've used the phrase already, so let's define it. For me, it's what will the user be able to do at the end of this learning experience that they couldn't do before? Simple as that. And if you don't define what you want users to get from learning right from the start, you slash your chances of success. So let's look at an example here. This is from the finance sector. Client-facing staff will be able to list the 5 acceptable forms of ID that should be requested when customers open new bank accounts. Now, that's quite long. I wouldn't expect that for every kind of learning outcome in, for example, a course, but it should be, as the jargon goes, smart, specific, measurable, accurate, realistic, targeted. It also makes it more testable. You want to avoid words like understand and go for specific words like explain, describe, list. Don't make them too vague and don't make them too high level. Maybe target them at a specific job role or process. Doing that will really, really be gold dust when you come and you design content on a screen-by-screen basis, because it gives you a very, very useful measure of whether you're on target. It also lets you chunk the content up. Now, this is a key ID principle. What it means is break the learning down into digestible, bite-sized objects. They could be screens within the course. They could be areas within an app. But whatever they are, try and break down around a particular learning object, a particular object or thing or screen or page in your learning resource. There are numerous advantages to doing that. It helps to make the learning experience more self-paced because people can move through things a small object at a time. They can bookmark stuff, come back later. It enables you to reuse assets. For example, an animation describing some process at a high level could maybe be used as a marketing tool to drive interest in the subject more widely within your organisation. And it keeps you focused on the essentials for each element of the learning. Am I doing what I said I'd do? Once you've done all that, put it in a storyboard. People call them scripts sometimes, but it's the same thing. Think of a film script. I don't know if any of you have ever used a script or a storyboard for an e-learning project, but that's what an ID produces. It's good to have a high-level map of, say, a course, listing every screen with a learning outcome next to it, and maybe a suggestion of how it be treated, a video, a question, presentation screen, and then a detailed storyboard that puts all the on-screen text that will be presented, all the audio for actors to read out, all the graphic descriptions for designers to use to make images and diagrams in a sequence that the learner will encounter them. That's absolutely vital. You can use Word, you can use PowerPoint, both are popular within the industry. I tend to use Word, and I think it's more favoured generally, because as you will probably know from doing document work, you can use track changes, edits. Often you'll have lots of stakeholders that an instructional designer will need to get inputs from and review, and it enables you to capture them more effectively. And finally, keep it creative. Keep it creative, keep it creative. It doesn't have to be expensive. Whatever your budget is, you've always got options. If you've got money, use videos. People love videos. Audio is good too. Animations, interactive diagrams, explain concepts. Or you can embed real-world assets like process documents, and give them tasks like treasure hunts. Go and look at the process for our equality and diversity. Go and look at the document for our equality and diversity process. Look at what the answer is if you're confronted with a particular situation, and come back and answer this question. And if you don't have the budget or the time for those things, just use an active writing approach. Use scenarios. Have striking examples. Subtle questions that invite drawing out misconceptions. All of these things are vital. Okay, top tips. Well, attention budget. Less is more. As someone rightly said, keep text to a minimum. That's absolutely true. People do not like to read as much word on the screen as they do on a page. So try and imagine that you've got a budget, a limited amount of time that your learner is going to pay attention for, and use as little of it as you can. I've seen so many courses fail because they're too long. People just glaze over and start clicking next. If you're doing a course or a module, maybe 30 minutes should be the kind of max you're aiming for. And if it's more than that, break it down into more modules. Think about how much time you've got. Reverse engineer content to fit that short, sweet, streamlined learning experience. Using resources can be a real get out of jail free card in this kind of situation, because you can put process documents, further links, all sorts of things into a resources area. Context, orientation. Would your mum get confused going through the course that you've designed? Signpostings. There needs to be a feel of an overall learning journey, beginning, middle, end. Storytelling has a real role. You don't have to use literal stories, but make sure the learner knows where they stand in a particular learning journey, because it flows a whole piece. Remember, there's no teacher there to fill the gaps in. If someone looking at a screen is going to get lost about why you're telling them something at a particular time, it's not going to work. 3, don't just say it's interesting, make it interesting. Well, that might be a bit of a cliche, but it's true. If you think you'd be bored reading it, then so your learner's going to be bored. There's a range of ways you can present information, taking into account different learning styles. So people like doing stuff, they like listening, they like reading, they like watching. Try and be conscious of that, and variety for its own sake is a good thing. Don't put 5 diagrams in a row. Break it up with a question in the middle. Use active writing. Don't say things like, in theory, it's good to do, say, you should do this, or, speak directly to the learner. And a final specific trick that I like using is to use quotes. They don't have to relate to the particular subject in intricate detail. Henry Ford said, I think it was, if you think you can do something or you think you can't do something, you're probably right. And I probably used that in about half a dozen courses on employee motivation, setting targets. Have a look online at quote websites. They're a goldmine for things you can drop in that really do strike a chord with people. I'm conscious I'm getting close to the end, so I'm going to speed up now. Sorry, guys. Measure each screen or asset against the learning outcome that's supposed to cover it and the users who are going to be learning from it. Don't forget to do that. That's really key. Use it as a checklist. And have regular interactivity. If it's a course, make sure that you don't just go for knowledge recall. What's the definition of this? Get people to apply things. Use scenarios. Get them to reflect. One thing that I've used time and time again is to reverse engineer questions around organisational failure points. So there's a particular process people are following. Write a question about that captures misconceptions and tempts people to make the mistake in the course that they're making in real life. And it's a golden opportunity to allow you to then counteract that misconception through feedback. Right, commissioning suppliers. So far, I've been writing, talking and explaining from a practitioner's point of view. But what about people who have to commission external content providers? Has anyone done that? Does anyone contract out content provision to other people, to third parties? Okay, well, I'll briefly cover it. One of you says yes, one of you says no, but I think it's worth covering just on a high level because it's something, the more you do online content provision, the more it's a possibility you might, and the point covers anyway, that if you're using someone external to the organisation to provide learning content, then understanding ID gives you more control over the content. You can tell them what you want. You can understand what's feasible to achieve. And this covers, having a freelancer come in and build something just as much as it does hiring a company. You can focus on quality once the basics are covered. You don't have to keep correcting the ship, keeping it on course. Because you can give people a very detailed brief. If you know exactly what you want to teach, to who, and in what kind of way, then someone doesn't have to kind of second guess what you need. And like I say, this might involve hiring a freelancer or a temporary staff member that you have to come in and add to your team. So it really helps you get the most out of them. Managing IDs. Again, has anybody had to actually manage an instructional designer as part of their team? Okay, good. Well, obviously, it's a privilege because IDs are just some of the loveliest people in the world. But above and beyond that, as with suppliers, knowing what you're doing helps you get the most out of people. You can also know when an issue is occurring in the content that's being designed that isn't the ID's fault. Sometimes people make mistakes and need to be motivated properly. Sometimes it might be that the course or the product hasn't been specified properly in the first place. So you'll know not to shoot the messenger. You'll empathise with the difficulties they're having, and you'll be able to get the inputs they need to produce something which is going to work. And finally, I would say, and this point covers both managing people and potentially suppliers as well, have a go yourself. Who here has actually done some instructional design themselves? Okay, good, brilliant. Lots of people are saying yes, so I'm not sure if anyone's going to say no in Moodle. That still counts? Moodle ID is as good as anything else? My apprentices have. Okay, brilliant. Well, Kerry, I guess now that you brought that up, I'm going to speak to you because you're the person who's raised the fact that they might not have done themselves, but their apprentice has. It's even if it's just once, it's invaluable to do it yourself. I've got a client, quite a major client, client X, where they often have issues with projects, with project scope, with budgets, even with team retention and design issues, because the senior team aren't practitioners. That means that you might be tempted to overlook a key issue early on. You might not predict knock-on effects, might not understand client requirements properly. You can overestimate how long things will take to do or underestimate how long things will take to do. So knowing how ID is done from the inside out gives you massive advantages in terms of getting the most out of your team and making sure that your learners get a quality output. Okay, we're almost done now, so let's look at a few quick resources. The internet is a wide and wonderful place of infinite variety, but in terms of ID, I'd say go for blogs. There's lots of stuff available there from commercial companies, but be aware they are commercial companies, so they'll have a commercial agenda, hidden or not so hidden. People like Leo, Kineo, the big people, they'll have white papers galore on their websites, and you can learn from them. But the ultimate aim of such sites is to sell you a service. So Kathy Moore, if you look at one person, look at Kathy Moore. She's very, very of the moment. She's very popular. As I said before, she has a particular process called action mapping, which is very popular in the corporate sector, but she has a lot more to say, so it's very much worth looking at Kathy Moore. Cami Bean is a senior ID at Kineo in America. They have a global footprint, so she is a good source of trends and what's going on, but bear in mind that she does work for Kineo. The e-learning coach, Connie Malamed, offers friendly advice. I would have a look there if you're trying to get different inputs. And instructionaldesign.org it's a bit basic, but it does give you a good overview of different things. And the misnamed Instructional Design Resources 2, deliberate mistake there. YouTube and Wikipedia are the biggest online resources for learning on the planet. So learn from them. The YouTube example, someone mentioned DIY as an example of something that they personally needed to learn about, and that's my story in terms of what I was thinking about when preparing this presentation. Think about what you do if you need to actually learn something in real life, like fix a shed roof. I'm terrible at DIY, but my 3-year-old has a playhouse, and I wanted to fix it, and I did. But what I didn't do was enroll on a DIY course, or take an evening class, or go and buy a big book. I used my phone. I looked at someone doing it while I was doing it, and it went well. Wikipedia. Everyone uses Wikipedia. What's its advantage? It has a high-level summary approach. You can then dive in as you will, cross-reference as you need to. So go and look at these 2 resources. The ADDIE model. Yep. Okay, great. Thanks, Rob. But just to finish about Wikipedia and YouTube, go and look at them with an ID head-on. Reflect on some of the things we've covered in the last 40 minutes. Look at them and try and learn something, whatever it is, DIY, cooking, bicycle maintenance, anything at all, playing guitar, and think about what worked for you. I imagine what might work is that there are bite-sized learning experiences, lots of examples, rich media when it was available in the form of videos. It was browsable. Essentially, it functions as a kind of performance support tool. You get something when you need it, you learn something really focused, and you go and do it in real life. And you can also take a similar approach to ID, even if you can't afford videos or anything fancy. If you make them very streamlined, chunked up into different objects that people can dip in and out of when they come back to them. And it really is good for putting together resources for kind of time-poor, just-in-time learning, which increasingly is what lots of people need to do. Right, well, you'll be pleased to hear that is it from me. But just from the point of view of good practice, as my old ID teacher used to tell me, it's best to finish up with a list of learning outcomes saying what you have just learned. So by now you should be able to give a definition of ID, explain why it's important, list common features, and give 5 top tips for effective ID. So I really hope you found this useful, and I've had a great time, really enjoyed it, hope that came across. Rob, over to you.
Daniel, thank you very much. Just stay with us for a second, everyone, because I'm just going to run you through the resources fairly quickly. But before I do that, can I just thank Daniel, because I think both the content and his answers and his really practical examples are really helpful. So on behalf of everybody, Daniel, thank you very much. You can see all the positive comments coming through. Just before people leave, thank you, Daniel, thanks. What I'd like to do is just share my screen with you for a second, because what I'd like to do is just show you the resources that we've put together. So if this has whet your appetite and you say, okay, I know a little bit about this, but I want to know some more, then what I'd like to do is show you the resources that we've put together to help you apply some of this and get a little bit more information. So you should see the Learning Futures website on your screen, and I'm just going to navigate to the Instructional Design CPD module. That's going to load in a couple of seconds, and you'll be familiar with that structure where we've got the 3 stages of the expert input, the CPD activity, and then the resources. So I'm just going to show you that activity quickly to start with, because it draws on a number of things that Daniel spoke about, but also Kevin mentioned about things like the ADDIE model. So with activities, they're not written to go in any particular order. We just suggest that you dip into them as an organisation and colleagues. So as you go back to your organisation, if you think, okay, I've bought into this, I think want to have another introduction for your staff, then we suggest you look at activity A, which is all about the why, what and how instructional design. So use the recording from the webinar, but also there's a resource there that really starts to help talk that through by Debbie Morrison's blog. The other activities in there, specifically Kevin picked up an aspect about there's lots and lots of learning theory and models behind instructional design, and if you like some of that information, if you think, yeah, pedagogy in theory is this based on, then have a look at activity B, and that will help you look at those, and we've put an extension activity there as well. Claire Dijert is another person who does some great blogs on instructional design, and what she feels makes for a great instructor, she's bones, brains and ballast, and that's activity C. We also mentioned here articulate. Some of you mentioned you're using Storyline, and there's 12 mini topics that we've tapped into here that we would suggest that if you want to really get your teeth into a little bit more about this, then that's going to be a good starting point for you. And a little bit of horizon scanning as well of what's going on in the world of instructional design, what are the sort of latest things that some of the instructional designers are looking at, and finally just to remind you to keep an eye on those projects that are part of as they use that instructional design and start to apply that with the projects and the CPD modules that they're creating themselves. So that's the CPD activities. They've got hyperlinks on there, but just to show you what they're linking to, if I open the resources, then you'll see the familiar Scoop It Bucket modules. So that's seconds to load. Okay, that's just loading now. And this is where you'll find all the resources. So everything in the CPD activity, but also a lot more in here as well. And some of the key people that Daniel was suggesting were people to sort of tap into blogs. You'll find all of that information in this Scoop It bucket. So please use that if you find that useful. If you want to do a little bit more, back into your place there for you. But remember, we would be delighted if you share how that works for your organisation. Just before we close, I'm going to bring up the final slide. I can see that there's a asked of Daniel. Just before Daniel does answer those, I'm aware of the time, so if people do need to disappear, I would just like to say thank you ever so much for your time today. I hope that you found that useful. Just wanted to thank Daniel again, because I thought the content, the way that was pitched, of looking at what's useful, and obviously it's a great big topic, but we've had a really good insight there from Daniel, and as I say, I hope that's whet your appetite to know a little bit more. So thank you ever so much. If you have to leave, please feel free to come back and look at the other webinars. Daniel, whilst you're still here, there was a quick question from Joe. If you'd like to have a quick look at that, is that okay?
Yes, of course. I think you're talking about open educational resources, but I'm not exactly sure what the example would be. Could you give me slightly more information, please?
So Joe's just typing.
Standing by. Although, Rob, please do jump in if you have more information.
No, I'm just looking at Joe's still typing a minute. I think it's going to be a longer response.
Sure.
I'm just going.
Are you familiar with OERs?
Yeah, they come up in the projects all the time, so many of the audience will be aware of what they are and how they use them.
No, what I meant was I'm not familiar with it. Could you give me a definition while I'm waiting for Joe's? Oh, right, okay. You mean, right, so I'm assuming you mean copyright-free assets that can be reused within a resource that you're... Yes, right.
Yeah.
Do I use them? Well, let me just think on my feet there. The quick answer is that I use a multitude of links. And links these days, because everyone is, ID and e-learning is very different now to how it was 10 years ago, for example, because everyone's got a smartphone or a tablet. So if you want to link to anything on YouTube, for example, or any kind of video, then if it's a link, you can do whatever you want. But the issue there is link decay, because that connection might degrade over time. So ideally, often you will want to embed an actual asset in the course itself. And there, it depends on the legal position. So, for example, when I was talking about having done the MOOC for the College of Estate Management, they did incorporate assets from, for example, investment banks and estate companies, because it was to do with property management, and they had a fairly rigorous process of contacting the copyright holder, not copyright in terms of getting an expensive piece of music or something, but just something that wasn't theirs, and making sure they had written permission. But they were very successful in that. So the answer to that is it was useful in presenting case study materials and say brochures, PDFs, that kind of stuff. But it was a commercially based degree about company profiles. So that's quite a specific answer. So I'd say my experience is that if you want to do that, it's very much worth aspiring to, but depending on your organisation's sensitivity to legal issues, you should make sure you know where you stand. But that's definitely not me saying don't do it, but just make sure you know what you're talking about.
Brilliant, thanks, Daniel. No, that's brilliant. That's really helpful. Okay, everyone, we're going to close down this meeting in a second. I'm aware that we've just gone over the hours. So as I get to say, thank you very much. I hope you found that useful on behalf of Learning Futures. If you wish to continue the conversation, then just use the either the blogs on the Learning Futures site, and we will pick up any of those comments there. But other than that, as I say, thank you so much for attending. I hope that's been useful for you, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. And a final thanks to Daniel. Absolutely spot on. Thank you very much.